Hello, everyone, and welcome to Baker McKenzie's Labor and Employment video chat series, The Employer Rapport. The Employer Rapport is our series of chats focused on topics in the workplace, and this is where you'll hear quick, practical tips from Baker attorneys on today's most pressing issues for employers as we navigate the new normal. My name is Susan Yandy, and I'm an employment lawyer in the firm's Palo Alto office. Today, I'm joined by my colleagues Robin Samuel from our LA office and Emily Harbison from our Houston office. So here we are again, same crew a few months later. We're several months past the first vaccinations in the US for first responders, with vaccines now increasing in availability for the general population. And in fact, as many of you are aware, I'm sure President Biden even recently declared that all adults in the United States should be eligible for vaccination by April 19th. So today I'm going to chat with Robin and Emily about what employers should keep in mind right now if they are considering mandatory vaccinations for their workplace. And let's start with Emily. This is an ever-evolving topic, my friend. As we hear of COVID-19 resurgence in several states, there's a push to get people vaccinated as quickly as possible, with concerns surrounding variants of the virus and what could happen in the fall if enough people haven't been vaccinated. So with all of that in mind, what guidance should employers be aware of regarding vaccinations and whether or not they actually can be made mandatory?
Sure. So to start, the EEOC has issued guidance specifically relating to employers saying that they can mandate COVID vaccines, but it's important for employers to also be aware of other federal guidelines from the FDA and CDC relating to vaccines that have been granted an emergency use authorization, or EUA, as opposed to a license by the FDA. So this guidance applies to all the three vaccines that are currently available in the US, Pfizer, Moderna, and J&J. Those vaccines have only all been granted EUA status and have not been licensed. And so while that particular guidance from the FDA and CDC doesn't specifically say it applies to employers, it's a bit of a gray area. And so let's go back to what the EEOC has said. Their guidance says employers can mandate vaccines, but they have to provide a reasonable accommodation under the ADA for employees who have a disability. And under Title VII, an accommodation has to be provided for employees who object to the vaccine on the basis of a sincerely held religious belief. Federal law, the other ones that I was talking about, issued by the guidelines by the CDC and the FDA, provide that at least until the vaccine is licensed, as opposed to having merely an EUA, individuals should have the option to accept or decline to be vaccinated. So basically, when the FDA grants an EAU for a vaccine, there are many questions about the vaccine that still can't be answered. Because of these open questions, when Congress granted the authority to issue EUAs, it decided to require that every individual should be allowed to decide for him or herself whether or not to receive a non-licensed FDA product or non-licensed EUA vaccine. So companies can encourage their employees to be vaccinated with any of the three vaccines under the federal guidance, but can't require it. Now, there's a gray area here, right? The EEOC has come in and said, specifically as it relates to employers and employees, companies can require their employees to be vaccinated. So we raised this issue just to say, go in eyes wide open. As you've probably seen in the news, many companies have said, regardless of potential gray area, we need to do what's best to protect our workforce. And because the EEOC has blessed mandating vaccines, we're going to mandate our workforce get vaccinated. But just be aware that it could be an open area for litigation if you require vaccines.
Great, super helpful, Emily. And I think just another good example of how the landscape keeps evolving as regulations keep coming down and lawyers crawl all over them to say, but wait, it didn't address this particular issue. And in the meantime, so many of our clients and those of you that are listening are eager to do something. And in fact, there's been a number of companies hitting the headlines today that have decided they are going to require vaccines in order to return to work. So with that, Robin, over to you. Considering all of this, what should employers do if they want their workplace vaccinated?
Yeah, we're telling clients that they should highly encourage or incentivize employees to be vaccinated because there are a bunch of good reasons why being vaccinated will help the employer and the employee down the road. But given this gray area and this uncertainty, you got to have a really good reason, I think, to make vaccines mandatory. And there may be circumstances where that is fully appropriate. Ultimately, my read on this is that the EUA issue is a red herring, and courts will uphold the employer's right to mandate vaccines. But I'm not the judge that's going to be deciding that issue. So, there's some litigation risk if you make it mandatory. So if you don't make it mandatory, you still have an obligation to provide a safe workplace. You still have an obligation under OSHA's general duty clause to ensure that your employees are protected to the extent you can reasonably do so. And so if employees are not vaccinated, you still have to keep in place for now all of the same health and safety protocols that we've been talking about for the last 8 months: the mask wearing, the face coverings, the social distancing, the cleaning, the hand washing, the testing, reporting of positive cases, et cetera. So, we're telling clients incentivize, and clients are being very creative about the way they're going about incentivizing employees to be vaccinated, whether it's paid time off or additional benefits, or easier access or more convenient access. And I think all of these issues will still play out in the near future, I think. We are starting to see health agencies, local health departments incorporate vaccination status into reopening protocols. For example, in LA County, if employees are vaccinated now, they don't necessarily have to be tested under some of the reopening protocols. And they also don't have to do the same screening that other employees have to do. So I think there will be a kind of a shift as vaccination works its way into all of these health department orders at the local level as well. And employers obviously need to keep their eyes on that as things evolve.
That is a perfect segue into an example of how there's so many different areas to check as to what you can and can't do when it comes to vaccines. I was surprised when the vaccination, just the term, the idea, the concept entered those LA health and safety orders around reopening, because it seemed a little soon, but there you go. So on that, Emily, for you, what about states? Are states coming down one way or another on the issue of whether vaccines can be made mandatory?
Yeah, so to make something complicated even more complicated, there are several states that either have new, pre-existing, or pending legislation that would prohibit mandating vaccines. And so the legislation varies, kind of across the 50 states, but it could make it difficult for employers to mandate vaccines depending upon where the workforce is located. So for instance, similar to Title VII, New Jersey and North Carolina laws prohibit employers from mandating immunizations if the employee objects on a religious basis. 11 states, including New York and Illinois, have pending legislation that would prohibit employers from requiring vaccination as a condition of employment, prohibiting employers from terminating an employee for refusing COVID-19 vaccine, and similar legislation, and some have introduced about not requiring proof of a vaccination for employment as well. And then on the other side of the spectrum, you've got 13 states, including Texas and Pennsylvania. They have pending anti-discrimination legislation that prohibits employers from discriminating against employees on the basis of COVID immunization status. So basically, you can't, terminate or hire or not hire somebody or change, any part of their terms and conditions of employment based on their vaccine status. So in several states, if pending legislation passes, employers may not be able to require employees to be vaccinated, even if vaccines that now only have that EUA status are ultimately granted licenses by the FDA. So employers should keep tabs on the applicable and pending legislation in the states where they have employees to ensure they aren't violating state and local laws as they craft their policies and protocols. And I think the name of the game here is being flexible, staying on top of things, and being willing to change as the laws both local, well, all three, local, state, and federal, continue to evolve when we get more clarity.
Perfect. So it's sort of business as usual for all of us, as it has been for the last, I don't know, feels like 10 years now, but not that long. And it's interesting, right? Because we obviously talk to a lot of companies that are multinational clients, and usually we say, well, the US and yes, state law, but generally you can come up with something, and really trying to come up with a global policy is going to be complicated. I think right now in the US, coming up with a nationwide policy in and of itself will be complicated because it is such a patchwork. So even if you had a policy, there may be a lot of in accordance with applicable law language to keep track of, which sounds great from a policy perspective, but then the implementation gets complicated. So with that, Robin, it's your turn now. We've seen that in some instances, state and local health departments are offering private employers the opportunity to take vaccine supply and have their own company nurse or healthcare provider administer the vaccine to workers. What should private employers think about if they're considering this route?
Yeah, and it's a great thing. I think the fact that we have enough vaccines now that employers can make them available to their employees is a wonderful thing, a wonderful opportunity for clients to take advantage of. And we're really seeing this come about in two different ways. One, the health department is allowing, the local health department is allowing the employer to partner with a third party, like a pharmacy or a local hospital, who will come on site, handle the administration of the vaccine, the paperwork, the screening questions, all of that. That's a lot easier for employers, and I think a lot less risky. And then two, there are some health departments that are saying, hey, we have vaccines, but we're a little short-staffed and we don't have healthcare providers to administer the doses. So we know you, Mr. Large Employer or Miss Large Employer, are sophisticated and you have nurses on staff, and you can offer these vaccines to your employees yourself. So in that second case, where the employer itself is administering the vaccines through its own personnel, obviously you have to have licensed staff to do that, and under the pandemic measures that have been passed by the federal government, it is now easier for different types of personnel to administer vaccines. It's not just doctors and nurses anymore, but you still want to make sure that whichever employees are administering the doses are licensed or qualified under the applicable legislation. And then you've got to think about other liability issues as an employer. If you administer doses to your employees, are you going to be held responsible if employees suffer severe consequences in response, and an allergic reaction or what have you to the vaccine? Fortunately, there is a federal statute, the Public Readiness and Emergency Preparedness Act, or the PrEP Act for short, which provides fairly broad immunity for employers who enable or authorize the administration of COVID-19 vaccines to employees. Under the PrEP Act, the HHS, the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, can issue emergency declarations when countermeasures are necessary for a public health emergency. And HHS has, in fact, issued a declaration for COVID-19. And they've also issued a series of opinion letters explaining what the declaration means. And so it's now very clear that an employer who provides a facility for the administration of vaccines to employees will be a covered, what they call program planner under the statute, under the PrEP Act for COVID-19. And you'll have broad liability immunity from liability for anything related to the administration, manufacture, distribution, et cetera, for vaccines. So that's things like slip and falls or adverse reactions or what have you. And also, as part of the PrEP Act declaration, there's a fund that has been set up for people who suffer injuries as a result of the vaccine, that they can seek compensation through that fund as well. But even with PrEP Act immunity, It's not complete immunity, so they still have to think about state discrimination laws. You still have to think about the ADA. You want to make sure that if your employees are administering the vaccines, that the screening questions for the vaccines might be a concern. Because while the EEOC has made clear that giving someone a vaccine or asking them about their vaccination status is not in either a medical exam or a prohibited disability-related inquiry under the ADA, those screening questions before you give them the vaccine may be disability-related inquiries. Those questions may lead employees to disclose to the employer underlying disabilities or medical conditions. And therefore, it's critical the way you handle that process. For one thing, you want to give everyone what's called a GINA safe harbor notice, which is the genetic information statute that says you cannot use or gather information concerning an employee's genetic characteristics or family medical history. Well, if there's a magic language, a safe harbor, that if you give it to employees, that notice or the safe harbor notice, and then they disclose to you medical information or family medical history inadvertently, you don't have a violation of the statute. So it's important to do that. Second, because those screening questions may be disability-related inquiries, before you ask them as an employer, you need to make sure that they are consistent with the business and they're necessary for the job. So what that basically means is you shouldn't be offering vaccines to employees who don't need them to do their job. But if they need them to work on site, if they have a customer-facing role, if there are other characteristics that enable the employees to work with the vaccine better than without, then you're probably okay asking those questions. You still have to treat them as confidential medical records. You still have to protect them from disclosure. You can have data breach issues if there's an inadvertent disclosure. You have to keep the records for at least under the ADA, et cetera. So, a lot to consider. There are potential liabilities for employers, but on the whole, this is a manageable thing. And we are seeing quite a few clients either running their own vaccine clinics now for COVID-19 or partnering with a local pharmacy to run the clinic for them.
Great, thanks, Robin. It's hard not to think that that is the wave of the future, if you will, just given how familiar and comfortable we've all become with flu vaccine clinics being held at the workplace. So it's probably a matter of working through the legalities, the logistics, being prepared, using magic language if it's something that you're going to offer, and things of that nature.
Yeah, actually, there's one thing I forgot to mention. If you're making vaccines available to employees on a voluntary basis, then there's less of a concern with those ADA pre-screening questions. As long as you make it clear that answering the questions itself is voluntary, then you should be good there too.
There you go. All right, perfect. So thanks again, Robin and Emily, for all of your time, for sharing your wisdom, your on-the-job, day-to-day experience that we're all getting in this area. And for our audience, we hope that you'll watch the other videos in this series where we share insight into various employment-related issues around hot topics that we're all addressing and facing right now. So thank you, everyone, and stay safe. Take care. Bye-bye.